Okay, ready to dive deep into something that I bet a lot of us struggle with. You know, those big, powerful emotions that sometimes feel like they're totally in control.
You mean like anger and frustration and when things just don't go your way?
Exactly, all those feelings that can really throw us off balance. So to help us get a handle on all that, we're going to turn to the wisdom of one of the greats,
Oh, you mean Carl Jung?
the one and only. We're using this awesome YouTube video as our guide. It breaks down Jung's ideas on how to basically master our emotions, even the tough ones.
Mastering emotions. That's a tall order.
Yeah, well, what really jumped out at me in this video was how Jung saw even the so-called, negative emotions as messengers. Like they're actually trying to tell us something important.
Right, instead of just trying to like stuff them down and pretend they're not there.
Exactly. So should we be trying to decode them instead of just ignoring them?
100%. And to understand this better, the video gets into this fascinating Jungian concept called the shadow.
The shadow. Okay, now I'm intrigued.
Yeah, so think of it as this hidden part of ourselves where we kind of bury all the stuff we don't want to deal with, fears, past hurts.
Maybe even those parts of our personality we think are, like, unacceptable.
Exactly. It's like that junk drawer we all have but pretend doesn't exist, except this one can really impact how we act.
Oh, I see. So we try to hide our shadow, but it still affects us.
Right, and the video gives this great example of someone at a dinner party. Someone says something seemingly harmless, and this person just blows up.
I've seen that happen.
Well, Jung would say it's not just the comment, it's that the comment poked at something sensitive in their shadow, something that hasn't been resolved.
Makes you wonder what's lurking in our own shadows, right? I've definitely had moments where I've totally overreacted to something small, and it always leaves me wondering where all that intensity came from.
Absolutely. Jung believed those overreactions are often our shadow trying to get our attention, like it's saying, hey, there's something unresolved here.
Okay, that makes it. So it's like a signal that we need to pay attention to.
Exactly. And speaking of signals, the video also really makes you rethink the whole idea that anger is always a bad thing.
Oh, yeah, I remember that part.
Jung didn't see anger as something to suppress. Instead, he viewed it as a signal, like a warning bell that something's not right.
So instead of just yelling at the person who, like, set off the alarm, we should be asking, okay, why did that push my button so hard?
Precisely. It's like if you touch a physical wound, it hurts, right? But that pain is trying to tell you to pay attention. Anger can be like that. It's telling us that an emotional wound needs attention.
Wow, that's such a good analogy. I'm definitely guilty of just reacting in anger sometimes without really thinking about why I'm so angry.
We've all been there. And that's what Jung encourages us to do, get curious about the source of the anger, not just the trigger.
Like those times when someone criticizes my work and I immediately get defensive. Maybe instead of jumping to defend myself, I should be asking, okay, what about that criticism felt especially threatening? What insecurity is it poking at?
Exactly. And the answer to that question might reveal a pattern in how you react to certain types of feedback. It can be really illuminating.
Okay, I'm adding that to my list of things to try. Now, the video also talked about this concept called projection. It seemed pretty complex.
Oh, projection. It sounds complicated, but it's actually more common than people might think. Projection happens when we see in other people the things that we don't like or can't accept in ourselves.
So it's not really them, it's me. Ouch. Can you give me an example?
No, imagine you have a coworker who you just find incredibly arrogant.
Yeah, I think we all know that person.
Right. But it's possible that deep down you have some fear of being perceived as arrogant yourself, so you're super sensitive to it in others.
Or what about when you feel constantly judged by someone? Like they're always finding fault with you.
That could be projection too. Maybe there's a part of you that's actually quite critical and judgmental even if you don't realize it, so you end up perceiving that same energy coming from others.
So how do we, tell the difference?
Well, if we're constantly feeling triggered by someone's behavior, it's worth asking, is this really all about them, or is it about something I haven't dealt with in myself?
Oh, that's a really good question. I like that. So the more we recognize our projections, the more we can take responsibility for our own feelings instead of blaming others.
Exactly. But then the question becomes, where do these patterns of projection come from? And that's where things get even more interesting.
Because this is where our past experiences come in, right? The video talked about how our childhood, in particular, can shape how we react emotionally as adults.
Yes, Jung had this idea of emotional programs. It's like we have these subconscious scripts that get written based on our early experiences.
So it's almost like those childhood experiences created a blueprint for how we react emotionally as adults.
It's a great way to put it because when we encounter a trigger, a specific person or situation, it can activate one of those old programs and cause a reaction that seems way out of proportion.
It's like we're time traveling back to that childhood experience.
That's a great way to describe it. And that's why understanding our triggers is so crucial. It helps us break free from those old patterns. The video had a couple of really compelling examples about this.
Oh yeah, let's hear 'em.
Well, one was about a guy named Roberto. He grew up in a very unpredictable home environment. As an adult, he realized that he would get incredibly angry whenever he felt out of control in any situation.
So his anger was coming from that feeling of powerlessness he experienced as a child.
Precisely. It was a way of trying to regain control. And then there was this woman, Mariana. She had a huge fight with her husband because he forgot to buy bread on the way home from work.
Oh, I think we've all had those moments where something seemingly small triggers a big reaction.
Right. But for Mariana, as she thought about it more, she realized the fight wasn't really about the bread. It was about years of feeling unappreciated and taken for granted in her marriage.
Wow, so the bread was just a trigger.
Yes. And those stories just highlight how seemingly small events can trigger these big emotional responses.
And how many of our reactions are probably rooted in the past without us even realizing it?
Exactly. But understanding those connections is the first step to rewriting those old scripts and creating new, healthier patterns.
This is all so insightful. But I do have a question. The video isn't saying that we should never feel negative emotions, right?
You're right. That's a really important point. Jung didn't believe that true resilience was about suppressing emotions.
It's about learning to choose how we respond to them.
Exactly. And that's a skill that takes practice. The video had this great story about a woman named Anna. She was initially devastated by her divorce.
Oh yeah, I remember that part.
She was consumed with self-blame and regret.
Well, I mean, divorce is a really painful experience.
It is, but Anna did something pretty remarkable. Instead of getting stuck in that self-blame, she chose to reframe her experience. She realized that she had done the best she could with the information and resources she had at the time.
So she was able to look at the situation with more compassion for herself.
Exactly. And that shift allowed her to move forward in a healthier way.
That's powerful. So we can actually choose how we respond even to really difficult situations.
Right. And before we move on, there's one more thing I wanted to touch on from the video.
Okay, what is it?
It taught about how integrating our shadow, all those parts of ourselves that we tend to hide, can actually make us emotionally stronger.
Interesting. So it's not about trying to get rid of the shadow.
It's about bringing those hidden parts into the light and integrating them.
Okay, that makes sense. But how do we do that? Where do we even begin?
Well, that's a great question, and one we'll dive into in the next part of our deep dive. Stay tuned.
All right, so we're back and ready to go deeper into this whole idea of understanding and working with our emotions. The last time we were talking about how our past experiences, especially stuff from childhood, can create those emotional programs. Like, it's almost as if there are these invisible buttons and somebody pushes the right one.
And boom, right. Out comes this reaction that might not make sense in the moment.
Exactly, like that whole bread fiasco with Mariana.
Oh, yeah. If she hadn't taken the time to really figure out why that forgotten bread caused such a huge reaction.
She might have just kept blaming her husband.
Right, and just felt constantly unappreciated.
So by getting that the bread was just a trigger, she could start to actually address those bigger feelings of, not feeling appreciated in the marriage.
It totally changes things. It shifts the focus from blaming someone else to understanding ourselves better.
So where do we even start with this whole trigger identification thing?
Well, it all starts with paying attention. Like the next time you feel this huge wave of emotion.
Anger, sadness, anxiety, all the fun stuff.
Exactly. Just take a second, pause and ask yourself, what just happened right before I felt this way? What were the words, the actions, the situations that seemed to set me off?
So we basically become emotional detectives?
Yeah, like we're trying to find the clues behind these big reactions.
Makes sense. But what exactly are we looking for?
Look for patterns. Are there certain themes that just keep coming up over and over again?
Like maybe I always get angry when I feel criticized.
That's a really common one. Or maybe you shut down emotionally when you feel rejected.
Okay, so we're mapping out our own personal emotional landscape. But isn't it hard to be objective about our reactions? Especially, in the heat of the moment.
You're totally right. And that's where journaling can be super helpful. It gives you a chance to step back from those intense emotions and reflect on them with like a clearer head.
It's almost like getting some distance, right?
Yeah. You can start by just describing the situation, how it made you feel physically.
What was going on in your body.
Exactly. And what thoughts were running through your mind.
So it's not just about venting. It's more about understanding the triggers and where they might be coming from.
That's the goal. And you can even use some journaling prompts like, when I feel, insert whatever emotion it reminds me of.
Oh, that's a good one.
Or, if this feeling could talk, what would it say? Sometimes the answers are closer than you think.
I love that. So we're becoming aware of our triggers. We're digging a little deeper to understand them. But how do we actually change how we respond to them?
Well, here's where things get a little more challenging. Remember how Jung believed that real resilience wasn't about suppressing emotions.
Right. It's about learning to choose how we respond.
Exactly. And that means we have to create some space between the trigger and our reaction.
Creating space. Okay, I'm not sure I get that. What does that even look like?
Think simple things like taking a few deep breaths before you react.
Okay.
Or maybe you need to walk away from the situation for a minute to collect your thoughts. The point is to interrupt that automatic reaction, that knee-jerk response.
Like hitting the pause button on that old emotional program.
Exactly. Give yourself a chance to make a more conscious choice about how you want to respond.
That makes sense. But what if the trigger is something that keeps happening? Like if there's this conflict with a coworker or a family member that keeps coming up, it's hard to keep hitting the pause button over and over again.
Oh, I hear that. And that's when it's really important to understand that whole concept of projection that we talked about earlier.
Right, like how we sometimes see in other people the qualities that we just can't accept in ourselves.
Yes. Like that example from the video about the person who was always annoyed by their controlling relative.
But they actually had some controlling tendencies they hadn't dealt with.
Spot on. So when you feel yourself constantly clashing with someone, ask yourself, why does this person push my buttons so much?
Is it because they're reminding me of something I don't like about myself?
Yeah. Is it possible that I'm actually reacting to something in them that I dislike or fear in myself?
Okay, I could see how that would be a really hard question to ask ourselves.
It can be, but it can also lead to some pretty amazing insights. So instead of trying to change the other person, we turn the spotlight inwards and ask, okay, what do I need to work on here?
Instead of always trying to fix everyone else.
Exactly. It's about taking ownership of our own emotional experience. But remember, this isn't about blaming ourselves. It's about approaching ourselves with a little bit of curiosity and compassion.
Compassion is so important because it's easy to beat ourselves up when we have these big reactions, especially if they cause problems with other people.
Totally agree. We've got to treat ourselves with the same kindness and understanding that we would offer a friend. And that means recognizing that we all have these shadow parts. The aspects of ourselves that we might not be so proud of.
The stuff we try to hide.
Yeah, but they're still a part of us.
So is this where that shadow work comes in? We talked about it before, but I'm still not totally sure I get it.
Shadow work is about consciously engaging with those shadow parts, bringing them into the light, so to speak. It's about integrating them into our sense of wholeness.
Okay. But that sounds kind of intimidating. How do we even start?
One way to approach it is to pay attention to the qualities in other people that trigger big reactions from us.
Like the people who really get under our skin.
Yep, those ones. The people we judge or criticize or sometimes even secretly admire.
Ooh, that's interesting.
Because the strong reactions are often a sign that something's being projected from our shadow. So if I'm constantly judging someone for being, say, arrogant, it's worth asking myself, is there a part of me that actually feels insecure or threatened by that?
It's like we're using those annoying people
as mirrors.
Exactly, to reflect those hidden parts of ourselves back to us.
And the more we can bring those shadow parts into the open, the more we can understand them and integrate them. And you know what? We actually become less likely to project them onto other people.
Okay, that makes sense. So shadow work is about understanding and integrating those hidden parts of ourselves.
Exactly. But what if those triggers are connected to some really painful stuff from the past, like trauma? Trying to face those shadows just seems like it could be incredibly overwhelming, maybe even dangerous.
Like it could bring up all those old wounds again.
Right, and that's really important to keep in mind. Shadow work can be hard, and it's not something we should always attempt to do on our own, especially if we're dealing with trauma.
It's okay to get help.
Exactly. A therapist can offer a safe space to process those difficult emotions.
That's good to remember. It's not about being a superhero. Sometimes the best thing we can do is reach out for help.
Absolutely. So we've talked about ritualization, shadow work, and the importance of seeking support. What else can help us ride those emotional waves?
Yeah, is there anything else we can add to our emotional toolkit?
Well, I think finding meaning and purpose in our lives is huge.
Whoa, getting deep now. But yeah, I can see how having a sense of purpose would help us, deal with all the tough stuff that life throws at us.
That's what Jung believed. When we know why we're getting out of bed each morning.
We're more resilient.
Exactly. It's like having that inner compass that helps you navigate all the ups and downs.
And finding meaning. It doesn't have to be this big, complicated thing, right?
Not at all. It could be connecting with your values, giving back to your community. It could even be just finding those little moments of joy throughout the day.
Those little things that make you feel alive.
Exactly. Because when you're aligned with your purpose, you just naturally become more resilient, more joyful. And guess what? You're way better equipped to handle difficult emotions when they come up.
I like that. So ritualization, shadow work, getting support when we need it, and finding our purpose.
Those are some great starting points.
This has been amazing. I feel like I have a whole new understanding of my emotions now.
Me too.
But for our listeners who are ready to, put all this into practice right now, are there any key takeaways you would emphasize?
First, remember that emotional resilience is a journey. It's not about reaching some perfect state. So be kind to yourself, celebrate the little wins, and don't hesitate to reach out for help when you need it.
Because we don't have to do it alone.
Exactly. And also remember this. You are not your emotions. You're this amazing, complex person who has emotions. But you're so much more than that.
It's like we can observe those emotions without being totally consumed by them.
Yes, and that is where true power comes from.
Love that. So we can't always control the emotional storms, but we can learn to weather them better.
That's a great way to put it, and that leads us perfectly into the final part of our deep dive, where we'll talk about even more ways to navigate those emotional storms and create a more fulfilling life.
Welcome back. So we've been on quite a journey with this deep dive into Carl Jung's ideas on mastering our emotions. We've uncovered the shadow self, learned how to spot our emotional triggers, and talked about reframing those knee-jerk reactions.
Yeah, it's been a lot.
But now I'm wondering, how do we actually live this stuff? How do we take it from theory and, actually make it part of our lives?
That's the big question, right? But luckily, Jung actually offered some pretty practical tools to help bridge that gap, between just thinking about our emotions and actually changing how we relate to them.
Okay, I'm all ears. What are some of those tools that we can, start using today to feel more in control?
Well, one thing that Jung really emphasized was something he called ritualization.
Ritualization. Okay, that sounds a little intense.
I know it sounds kind of mystical or complicated, but it's really just about creating conscious routines and practices that help us connect with ourselves.
So we're not talking about chanting under a full moon or anything?
Not unless that's your thing. It can be as simple as starting each day with a few minutes of mindfulness or taking a walk in nature.
Oh, okay. It's more about finding little things throughout the day that help ground us.
Yes, think of it like creating mini retreats throughout your day, to recharge and reset.
I like that, mini retreats. Because it can feel like our days are just constant chaos.
Exactly. And the great thing is you can totally personalize these rituals, whatever works for you.
Okay, so what kinds of things are we talking about?
Well, some people find it helpful to start a gratitude practice, like taking a few minutes each day to just think about things they're grateful for. It could be as simple as writing down 3 things in a journal before you go to sleep.
Okay, that seems manageable.
Others find it helpful to tap into creative expression, whether that's through art, music, writing.
Whatever gets those creative juices flowing.
Right. But even little things can make a difference, like making your bed in the morning or taking a few deep breaths before responding to a stressful email.
Those little acts of mindfulness.
Yeah, exactly. They can really make a difference.
Okay, I'm definitely going to try to incorporate some more mini retreats into my day. But what else? What other Jungian wisdom can we add to our emotional toolkit?
Well, we've talked a lot about the shadow, but now let's talk about how we can actually work with it. Jung called this shadow work, and it's about consciously facing those parts of ourselves that we tend to reject or deny.
Oh, this is where things get real. It sounds a little scary, to be honest. Where do we even begin to face all that stuff that we've been trying so hard to ignore?
A good place to start is by paying attention to the things and other people that trigger big reactions in us.
Oh, right. Right. Because those strong reactions, whether it's judgment or irritation or even admiration, they can actually point to something we're projecting from our own shadow.
Exactly. It's like we're using other people as mirrors.
So if someone's bragging is really bugging me, maybe it's because I'm insecure about my own accomplishments.
It's possible. So instead of just getting caught up in that judgment,
We ask ourselves, why is this bothering me so much?
yeah, what part of me feels threatened or triggered by this? It's like turning those negative judgments into an opportunity to learn something about ourselves.
It's like those people who annoy us are actually doing us a favor by, highlighting those parts of ourselves that we need to work on.
That's one way to look at it. And as we shine a light on those shadow parts, we can understand them better, and we actually become less likely to project them onto other people.
So it's like this ongoing process of self-discovery.
Yes, but, it's really important to acknowledge that shadow work can be tough, especially if those triggers are connected to painful stuff from our past, like trauma or abuse.
Right, right. Because facing those shadows, it just seems like it could bring up all kinds of difficult emotions.
It can, and in those cases, working with a therapist is incredibly valuable.
So it's okay to ask for help.
Of course. Sometimes reaching out for support is the brainest and most compassionate thing we can do.
That's good to remember. Okay, so we've got ritualization, shadow work, and getting support. What else can help us navigate those emotional waves?
This might sound a little bit cliche, but I think finding meaning and purpose in our lives is really essential.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, when we have that sense of purpose, it just makes everything a little bit easier to handle.
Exactly. Jung believed that when we know why we're here, we naturally become more resilient.
It's like having that inner compass that keeps us moving forward, even when things are tough.
That's a great way to describe it. And that meaning, it doesn't have to be this big, grand thing. It could be connecting with your values, finding those little moments of joy, doing something that makes you feel truly alive.
Those things that light us up.
Exactly. When you're in alignment with that, you just become more resilient, more joyful, and you're way better able to handle those tough emotions when they do show up.
This has been incredible. I feel like I have a whole new perspective on how to approach my emotions. Any final words of wisdom for our listeners as they, start to put all this into practice?
Remember, this is a journey. It's not about reaching some kind of perfect state. So be patient with yourself, celebrate your progress, and don't be afraid to ask for help along the way.
That's great advice. And, to all our listeners out there, you're not alone on this path. Lean on those you trust, seek support, and most importantly, be kind to yourself. Keep diving deep and keep exploring.